Now, they caused delays and disorder by barricading roads and bridges across the capital, all in an effort to sound the alarm on climate change. The coordinated civil disobedience was organised by Extinction Rebellion, a movement founded last year to demand a tougher climate change target from the government, net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2025. Protests ended this week, but after 10 days of disruption, how effective was the action? Well, I'm joined now by the Guardian columnist and environmental activist George Monbiot and a visiting professor for forecasting and innovation from the South Bank University, James Woodhousen. Gentlemen, many thanks indeed for joining us this afternoon. George, if I can firstly start with you. Now we've had a few days to reflect on the protests. What do you think they achieved?
They've been quite extraordinary in putting this issue where it belongs, right at the front and centre. And the reason why we're having this discussion now, when, it has to be said, the media has really neglected our great existential climate and environmental crisis, is because Extinction Rebellion has been highly successful at pointing to the issues we should be discussing.
Do you think you won or lost the support of the public? There was major disruption to central London, reports of somewhere in the region of £25 million to loss to businesses. Did you have the public on your side?
Well, when you say you and your, I should point out I'm not speaking on behalf of Extinction Rebellion, only on behalf of myself. But did they win people round? Yes, the opinion polls show very clearly that they did. And what's remarkable is that disruptive protests like this are often quite unpopular. But in this case, it seems to have generated a lot of popular support because people do recognise that politics, the media, business, life in general has greatly neglected these massive issues, which we should all be talking about almost all the time.
James Woodhousen, it was all worth it in the end.
Well, I wonder whether George reads the papers or watches TV, because David Shukman and Roger Harabin on the BBC continually blast us with the climate apocalypse. If you look at Greta Thunberg, she's been backed by the Evening Osborne, or I should say the Evening Standard, by the Times, by the BBC again, by Channel 4 News. So it's ridiculous to say that the demonstration really raised awareness after a media blackout on climate change. We've had a thin gruel of climate change catastrophism for a very long time now.
It has raised awareness, though, because, we are talking about it now. We were talking about it all last week and the week before. It was making all the newspaper headlines. So has the job not been done as a result of that?
I'm not sure who that's addressed.
It's to you, James.
Well, I wonder whether the opinion polls that George quotes, the people consulted on that, do they realise what no net carbon emissions means for 2025? It means, and I'm quoting from the Energy Research Council, which is a government research council, it means 85% less heat, and end of most jobs in iron, steel, chemicals, oil, food and drink, cement, pulp and paper, and glass. It's not my idea, that's from the government source. So really what we're talking about for 2025, if you want to get rid of carbon emissions, is austerity, a whole lot more of it, and the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs. I wonder whether people consulted by the opinion polls really know that.
George, it's an interesting point made by James there, because one of the accusations that has been made at the Extinction Rebellion protesters is that their demands are unrealistic. For example, the Committee on Climate Change, which advises the government, says that target of 2025 is simply unrealistic, and actually maybe something like 2050 is a more realistic target.
Well, there are two completely different kinds of realism here. There's what we call political realism and there's scientific realism. And what Extinction Rebellion are doing is attending to the scientific realism, because the science is saying that's the sort of speed of cuts we need to make if we're to avoid 1.5 or 2 degrees of global heating, both of which have catastrophic implications for many of the people on Earth. And of course, the political reality says, oh, no, we can't possibly do that. Now, political realities can change, and they can change dramatically, like when the US entered the Second World War, for example, and managed to turn the entire economy around on a dime, from a civilian manufacturing economy to a military manufacturing economy. And a lot of people said it can't be done, and it turned out it could be done. So what I'm saying is that political realities are fluid. They're not set in stone. Scientific realities, unfortunately, you can't negotiate with them. You can't argue with the laws of thermodynamics. You can't argue with physics. And so what we should be doing, and where I think Extinction Rebellion are right, is that we should be attending to the scientific realities and shifting political reality so that it falls into line with scientific reality.
James Woodhousen?
Well, I read physics at university, and you can always argue with physics. That's the whole point about science. It's an open-ended endeavour. As George knows, I believe in climate change, and I believe in the man-made component of climate change. That's one thing. What I want to know from George is whether he really favours the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs, cuts in working-class consumption, no more transport by car, no more transport by flights, and the whole of the electricity system would have to be completely done over to renewables, which I know George supports, and nuclear, which we actually agree on is a good thing. That's not going to happen in the next 6 years.
George Monbiot?
Could I answer that question, please? Yes, I mean, what we're talking about here is a massive shift in production and the service economy, and that's going to generate huge numbers of jobs. It's true that jobs in some sectors will be lost because we can't afford to keep burning fossil fuels. And so there's going to be losses in fossil fuel powered sectors. But at the same time, we need to create a massive number of jobs in renewables, in a circular economy, in better ways of producing and delivering goods and services which aren't going to compromise our chances of continued well-being and prosperity. And so, you know, if we do this right, like the Green New Deal proponents are suggesting in the US, for example, we could see a major rise in employment and indeed in quality jobs.
James Woodhousen, I mean, again, there have been reports over the last week that members of the Extinction Rebellion group are going to be meeting government ministers, including the Environment Secretary, Michael Gove. I mean, does that tell us that there is a willingness now to take this issue seriously and there is a mood for some form of change?
Well, I don't know that we have a government at the moment, especially after the leak from the National Security Council. I think that it's very obvious, and I'm sure George agrees with that the Tories are flailing around. They'll look for any port in a storm. And they, along with 36 central banks around the world, are very worried about climate change and climate risk. They indulge a 16-year-old woman in the way that we've seen in the last year, thinking she is the fount of all knowledge. And,
well, she's not. She's just campaigning she's campaigning because she believes our world is in peril.
If I may finish the point. Thank you. They think it's very populist to play the climate change card. I'm not sure it is really, because working class people and the majority of the population do not want their living standards depressed. And that's actually what George is calling for. Less consumption, less power generation except by the means that he favours, no more transport, no more cooking in the home. Already Lord Gummer, or I should say Lord Debon's Committee on Climate Change has called for that. So we're really looking at the hair shirt economy here.
George, I see you shaking your head.
It's very kind of James to tell me what I stand for, including a whole lot of positions which are completely unfamiliar to me. No, what we're talking about is a different way of doing things. We're not talking about cancelling the whole economy, and we're talking about doing so in order to ensure that we can sustain our well-being, because there is no greater threat to human well-being, as well as the rest of life on Earth, than climate breakdown and environmental breakdown. And so Extinction Rebellion have done us a tremendous benefit here by getting us talking about this much more seriously, talking about ramping up ambition, which is why they're meeting government ministers. And I could assure James, this isn't a populist ploy. This is, something which is, you have to think and act at a deep level in order to deal with this stuff. These, are complicated issues, and it's to their credit that government ministers are prepared to meet Extinction Rebellion. I'm pleased about that. And it's great that Extinction Rebellion are pushing them to be a lot more ambitious.
OK, George Monbiot, James Woodhouse, we're out of time, I'm afraid. Gentlemen, appreciate your time. Interesting debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much.